In a small European town, in an old square surrounded by narrow cobblestone streets, a violin played every night. Its melody filled the silence with a warm, slightly melancholic sound, making passers-by slow their steps, hold their breath, and forget their worries. It was Alexei, a street musician, a tall man with a slightly worn coat, streaks of gray in his hair, and eyes as deep as the music itself. His fingers glided skillfully over the strings while his bow danced, drawing out sounds that seemed to speak to people's souls. Beside him always sat Bruno, an old Labrador with dark golden fur and wise eyes. He never barked, never whimpered, never got distracted. It seemed as if he understood every note, absorbing it and living through it alongside his owner. 10 years ago, Alexei had found Bruno as a puppy. Back then, the little dog had been trembling under a bench in the city park, curled up in a corner, scared, thin, unwanted. Alexei couldn't just walk past him. He carefully extended his hand, and though hesitant, Bruno crept closer. Since then, they had been inseparable. The musician lived modestly. His earnings were just enough to rent a tiny room in an old building, afford a bowl of soup, and buy food for Bruno. But Alexei never complained. He often said, "I don't play for money. I play to make the world a little more beautiful." Every evening he would go to the square, open his worn violin case, place his old violin inside, take a few deep breaths, and begin to play. The melody flowed through the streets, slipping into windows, gliding over rooftops, filling people's hearts with a quiet sorrow. Some townspeople always passed by, nodding to the musician, tossing coins into the case. Children would sometimes run up to pet Bruno, while the elderly would sit on a bench listening to the music of their youth. But one evening, on a cold winter night, everything changed. That winter was harsh. Gusts of icy wind swept through the narrow streets, forcing people to wrap themselves in their coats and hurry along their way. Alexei stepped onto the square once more, undeterred by the cold. He never missed an evening. Music was his life. As always, Bruno sat beside him, closed his eyes, and prepared to listen. The first notes trembled from the taut strings, filling the empty square. That evening, almost no one lingered. Only a few people stopped for a brief moment, tossed some coins, and hurried on, burying their faces in their scarves. Alexei was about to finish when a sharp pain pierced his chest. The world spun around him, his legs gave way, and he collapsed to his knees. His violin slipped from his hands, landing on the cobblestone with a dull sound. Bruno jumped up instantly, his body tense with worry. He nudged his owner's cheek with his nose, barked anxiously. But Alexei didn't move. Passers-by stopped. Some rushed to his side, others pulled out their phones, calling for an ambulance. Minutes later, the square filled with the sound of sirens. "He's having a heart attack," a man in a black coat shouted, kneeling beside Alexei. The paramedics quickly lifted him onto a stretcher, and Bruno tried to follow, but they pushed him back. "No dogs allowed." The dog growled, but the ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle disappeared into the night. Bruno remained on the square, next to the abandoned violin. He watched the ambulance drive away, then slowly lay down on the cold stone, still hoping his owner would return. Hours passed. The people dispersed, and the snow covered the cobblestone. Bruno did not move. The next evening, he was there again, and the next, and the day after that. But Alexei never returned. 3 days had passed since the ambulance had taken Alexei away. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of the old town, Bruno would appear in the central square. He would sit in the very spot where his owner had always played and wait. The dog didn't understand where Alexei had gone. He only knew that his music no longer filled the air. The violin still rested in its case, which someone had carefully placed against the wall of a building, as if hoping the musician would return at any moment to pick it up again. On the first day, a few passers-by tried to take Bruno with them. "Poor thing, he must be hungry," a woman said, offering him a piece of bread. but Bruno didn't touch it. He only looked at her with sad eyes and kept waiting. On the second day, a street cleaner tried to chase him away with a broom, grumbling, "Go on, get out of here, no place for a stray dog." But just as he raised his broom, a young woman named Amelia stepped forward and stopped him. "Leave him be. That's the musician's dog. He's waiting." The cleaner huffed and walked away, while Amelia carefully knelt beside Bruno. She remembered Alexei. She had often listened to his music, sometimes tossing coins into his case. Now, all she saw was the dog, left completely alone. "Poor thing," she murmured, gently stroking his head. Bruno didn't pull away, but he didn't react either. A week passed. The townspeople had grown used to the lone dog in the square. Some brought him food, though he rarely ate. Some tried to take him home, but he always found his way back. One evening, an elderly man who had often listened to Alexei's music sat down on a bench beside Bruno and spoke. "He's not coming back, my friend." Bruno lifted his head, gazing at the man, but he didn't move. He didn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning. Then the old man reached into his coat and pulled out a violin bow. "They left your owner's violin at the house where he lived. I asked to take it, thought maybe someone else would play it." Bruno's eyes flicked to the bow, then to the man's hands. A glimmer of hope appeared in them, but the old man's hands were empty. There was no music. The dog lay back down with a heavy sigh. 2 weeks passed. Bruno had grown thinner, yet he kept waiting. The passers-by no longer found it strange to see him there. Many still brought him food, and someone had even laid down an old blanket to keep him warm. But he refused to leave. Then, one day, Amelia came to the square. In her hands, she held the violin. Slowly, she opened the case, lifted the instrument, and, taking a deep breath, drew the bow across the strings. The first notes wavered, uncertain, but then the music filled the streets. It was the very melody Alexei had played most often, gentle, sorrowful, yet warm. Bruno flinched. His ears perked up, his head lifted. He listened. He remembered these sounds. He had been waiting for them. And when the music faded, he rose, walked over to Amelia, and lay down at her feet. That day, for the first time in a long while, he closed his eyes not out of sorrow, but out of peace. He knew the music lived on. And that meant Alexei was still somewhere nearby. The sounds of the violin filled the square, echoing off the walls of the old buildings. Amelia played the very melody that Alexei used to perform every night, and in that moment, it felt as if he was still there. Bruno listened, holding his breath. For the first time in many days, he felt that his master was somewhere nearby. When the music faded, the dog slowly approached Amelia, pressed his cold nose against her palm, and looked into her eyes. There was something more in them than just canine loyalty. It was a plea. Amelia sighed, crouched down, and quietly said, "You're still waiting for him, aren't you?" Bruno didn't look away. The girl gently ran her hand over his head, then stood up and looked at the people gathered around. "Does anyone know what happened to him? Where is he?" The people exchanged glances. "They say he's in the hospital, in critical condition," replied an elderly man who often listened to Alexei's music. "In the hospital?" Amelia froze. "Yes, no one knows for sure, but it seems he had a severe heart attack." The girl lowered her gaze to Bruno. "He needs to see him." The dog seemed to understand her words. He wagged his tail and got up, as if ready to go immediately. Amelia didn't hesitate. The hospital was on the other side of the city. Someone from the crowd handed her a leash and she took Bruno, leading him forward. The dog didn't resist. He simply walked beside her, sensing that she was taking him to Alexei. The road felt endless. When they finally reached the hospital, Amelia approached the nurse at the front desk. "Excuse me, is Alexei here? The musician from the square?" "Yes, but no visitors are allowed. He's in serious condition." please." Emilia looked at Bruno. "This dog has been waiting for him for 2 weeks." The nurse frowned. "It's against the rules." "I understand, but he might not have much time." Bruno sat at her feet looking straight into the nurse's eyes. The nurse hesitated, then let out a quiet sigh. "All right, but only for a couple of minutes." The room was silent. Alexei lay in bed, connected to machines. He was pale, his eyes closed. Emilia carefully let go of the leash. "Go, Bruno." The dog slowly walked up to the bed. He sniffed the air as if making sure it was truly his master. Then he gently rested his head on the edge of the bed. A second passed, another, and then Alexei's fingers twitched slightly. Emilia held her breath. Alexei slowly opened his eyes. They were dull, tired, but alive. He saw Bruno, and in a whisper he said, "You came." The dog whimpered softly and pressed his nose against his hand. In that moment, the music played again. Not in notes, not in strings, but in their hearts. Alexei smiled. He had returned. The room was filled with silence, broken only by the quiet sound of breathing. Alexei, weakened by illness, could barely move his hand, but he kept stroking Bruno's head. Gratitude shone in his eyes, not just for the dog's loyalty, but for the very chance to see him again. Emilia stood nearby, unable to hold back her tears. She felt that she had become part of something greater, a story where devotion and love proved stronger than time, distance, and even death itself. "You were waited for, Alexei. For 2 weeks," she said softly. The musician gave a faint smile. "I heard music. Every night." His voice was quiet like a distant echo. "And now I understand. It was him." Bruno gazed at him intently, as if he understood every word. Weeks passed. Alexei began to recover. His hands were still weak, but the doctor said he would pull through. And he knew. It was largely because his friend never gave up. On the day of his discharge, Emilia stood at the hospital entrance, Bruno by her side. As soon as Alexei stepped outside, the dog let out a joyful bark, leaped onto his chest, and nearly knocked him over. "Easy, easy, buddy. I'm still not that strong." Alexei laughed but hugged him tightly. Emilia watched, smiling. "So, where to now?" Alexei looked at her, then at the dog, and finally at the sky, which that day was as clear as a new melody. Home. More time passed. Music once again filled the central square. People stopped to listen, dropping coins into the case. Everything was as it had been before. But now, beside the musician, there was always a dog. Bruno no longer waited. He knew his master was always near, and they would never be apart again.